Today, I'd like to start with a message from Kristen Godsey at the New York Times about why women had better sex under communism. This is a real article. Some of you may recall that's from 2017, I think. Now, those of you who've been listening to the show for a bit will know what I think about communism, know what I think about the Soviet Union. We've been talking and will continue to talk about the Gulag and Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. But let's read Godsey's take on what was good about, what was nice about life under Stalin and in the Eastern Bloc. Some might remember that Eastern Bloc women enjoyed many rights and privileges unknown in liberal democracies at the time, including major state investments in their education and training, their full incorporation into the labor force, generous maternity leave allowances, and guaranteed free childcare. But there's one advantage that has received little attention. Women under communism enjoyed more sexual pleasure. Oh my gosh, this is a real thing, and I promise I'm going somewhere with it, but I do just have to read to you a little bit more of this article. Here she continues. Consider Anna Durcheva from Bulgaria, who was 65 when I first met her in 2011. Having lived her first 43 years under communism, she often complained that the new free market hindered Bulgarians' ability to develop healthy amorous relationships. Sure, some things were bad during that time, but my life was full of romance, she said. After my divorce, I had my job and my salary, and I didn't need a man to support me. I could do as I please. Ms. Durcheva was a single mother for many years, but she insisted that her life before 1989 was more gratifying than the stressful existence of her daughter, who was born in the late 1970s. Now, this part is really interesting to me. All she does is work and work, Ms. Durcheva told me in 2013, and when she comes home at night, she is too tired to be with her husband. But it doesn't matter because he is tired too. They sit together in front of the television like zombies. When I was her age, we had much more fun. Now, I am reading to you from this article today because Women Have Better Sex Under Communism is literally the plot of a play by Aristophanes. We've done Aristophanes now once before, the great exemplar of old comedy in Athens, put on his comedies at the City Dionysia and the Lenaea. But there's a play called Assemblywomen, or Ecclesiasdusai, which we haven't talked about yet, which is basically about women taking control. It's about trans-communist utopia. Not really, but it's about women pretending to be men and turning over the state to the women and then establishing communism and enforcing that men have to sleep with ugly women as well as beautiful women. Now, I'm going to get into more detail about how the whole play works and what the plot is itself, but I just wanted to say why we're talking about this now. It's kind of a coda to the stuff that we've been talking about with the, Christine de Pizan and womanhood and the abolition of women, right? I mentioned that there's this confusion among liberals that, as everything gets better for women, as they go into the workforce more and more, they get less and less happy. And one explanation for this is that because that means they have to do both the whole housework and work in the office. But notice which side the balance lies on, even according to communist survivors of communism who look at modern day women and say all she does is work and work, right? So there is actually, I made fun of this article at first because, of course, to emphasize like good sex for women is kind of parodical given what we know about the atrocities of the Soviet Union and of communism more generally. But there is this sort of interesting thread of a point here, which is that Western democracies, as they have basically, it sounds like, imitated the Soviet Union in these sort of modern feminist ideals of state-run institutions that give women, all of this, basically, shunt women into the workforce. It does take away from your home life. But notice, right, it's true of men too. So this is this weird feminist framing of a thing that seems to be true for everybody, right? Her husband is too tired too. I talked last week about demoting work in our lives to a certain extent, right? This is like, everybody, it seems, is basically slaving away over constant, nonstop work and too tired to have sex and have fun. But, right, this ideal, right, that what we really need to do is just have communism and then it would all be better, right? This is a kind of fantasy and a weirdly feminist fantasy. Communism and feminism are weirdly bound up, as I'm going to get into. That, if we just lived in a communist utopia, everything would be so much better. We wouldn't have to work so hard. all the time. Whatever the solution is to our being overworked and not having enough sex, it is surely not that, which is why this article is so ridiculous. And it's exactly what Aristophanes is making fun of in this play, The Assemblywomen. So, like I said, Ekklesiasdoussai is the Greek title, which means, those women of the assembly, performed pretty late in Aristophanes' career, post-Peloponnesian War, 391 BC, post-death of Socrates. So after Socrates has indicted Aristophanes for being part of his trial, and it was performed, we actually don't know whether it was performed at the Lanaya, which is the sort of smaller festival, or the city Dionysia. But one thing that does seem to me to be really true is that this is a comedy of decline and nihilism. That is, it's a comedy, it's kind of an antic, zany comedy, like many of Aristophanes' plays are. And it, like much of old comedy, it has these jabs at particular politicians, kind of in-jokes about Athenian society. But it's also this weirdly sort of absurdist descent into madness that ends in this orgiastic celebration when you know that everything is about to go terribly wrong. And it's actually very artfully and subtly done, but you have to kind of get into it to understand what Aristophanes is doing. So I mentioned last time that my copy of the new translation of 4 plays by Aristophanes was delayed by snow. It has finally gotten here. It's called 4 Plays of Aristophanes, translated by Aaron Puchigian or Puchigian. Again, I never know how to pronounce these modern people's names. So they can write into me, I guess, and get mad at me if I'm pronouncing it wrong. But this is a really lovely little translation. Very, very modern and doesn't flinch away from Aristophanes' bad language. Let me warn you about Aristophanes' bad language. There is real, smutty talk in these plays. That's part of the fun of them. They're kind of like Seth Rogen comedies in that way. They're all about sex and relation between the genders and so on and so forth. But this one is also about gender and politics. And it's, remember I said last week that, each side of the world has its own excesses and faults, right? Men have their unique excesses, women have their unique excesses. This is a parody about what would happen if women's excesses went wild and ran the world, right? So the way that it happens, like I said, is the women meet in secret. The women of the city meet in secret, dressed up as men, and practice this plot that they're going to have to take over the state, to have all the laws and the lawmaking handed over to the women. Of course, right, men run the democracy in Athens, and so this is going to be a woman-run world. It works, right? They hand the state over to the women. Women run it. Praxagora, who's kind of the lead of the whole thing, immediately declares that there's going to be total communism of goods and services. Everybody's going to pool all their resources, and we're just going to eat from a common mess hall, essentially, every day. And it's going to be great. There's going to be feasting. There's going to be all sorts of, dancing and joy. And there's also going to be communism of spouses. We're going to abolish the family. No more family. Just like in Plato's Republic, we'll have koinonia of spouses in which everybody sleeps with anybody that they want. But there's one catch. Men, if they want to sleep with a hot chick, have to sleep with an ugly woman first. And the same thing goes for women. If you want to sleep with a hot guy, you have to sleep with an ugly guy first. So it's this total rearrangement of all social norms, exactly like, and again, we'll get into this later on, but this is exactly identical to what many of our most radical Marxists and feminists are currently calling for. So it's a great play to read at the moment, and it's also a great play to read now that we've been thinking about the virtues and the excellence of womanhood. Here we talk about some of the pitfalls of women run amok. So let's begin in this scene, this sort of conspiratorial scene in which all the women are getting together, trying to figure out how to be men. And it is kind of a funny, like today it would be sort of a trans scene because they talk about how they've let their armpit hair grow out, or maybe that's not trans, maybe that's just like second wave feminism, but they've let their armpit hair grow out, they're trying to be manly, they keep forgetting that they're men, so there's sort of all sorts of jokes about that. And then they start practicing their speeches about why women should run the world. This is Praxagora. I shall prove the female character is better than the male. First off, they all adhere to ancient precedent in that they use warm water when they dye their wool. No, you would never see them making any innovations, while the city of Athens won't stick to any customs, even though they work quite well. Oh no, the men would have to mess with them and try out something novel. Meanwhile, the women cook the meals like always and carry burdens on their heads like always. They celebrate the thesmophoria like always and, like always, bake sweet rolls. Like always, they annoy their husbands and, like always, stash their lovers in the house. They purchase extra goodies for themselves, like always, and like always, love their wine unmixed. Like always, and forgive the language, but this is, part of the translation that doesn't shy away from it. Like always, they are fond of fucking. So, in conclusion, gentlemen, let's hand the rule of Athens over to the women. No blabbering about it. No inquiring what they are planning to accomplish. No, let's simply let them rule, considering that first, as mothers, they will want to keep our soldiers safe, and second, who would sooner send the soldiers rations than the ones who gave them birth? Women are very clever when it comes to getting funds, and they will not be cheated when they are in power, because they all themselves are expert cheaters. I will omit my other points. If you accede to my proposal, you will all lead happy lives. Now, there are a couple points that I want to make about this because, again, Aristophanes is so funny, so parodical, that if you blink, you can sometimes miss what he's doing. But one of the things that he brilliantly understands is that these kinds of radical movements, like, radical feminist communism, which is what we would call it today, right? They don't arise unless there is some kind of failure or lack that the other side isn't standing up. And the men in this play, it's subtly done, but the men in this play are not standing up, or they're falling down on their job in their own ways. One of which, Aristophanes is generally pretty anti-innovation. And this is a common thread of a lot of Greek literature, that they're constantly trying out new things, constantly tearing down old walls. This is one of the excesses of democracy, right? If you have an absolute democracy, then you're going to end up with just this passion for novelty and this disrespect for tradition. And Aristophanes is basically saying this is leaving you open to this critique that men are constantly going after every new thing. Women are kind of more staid and more devoted, including to all sorts of things that like they shouldn't be doing, like stashing their lovers in the house. So he's sort of parodying the vices and the venality of both genders. And then he comes out with this kind of more serious argument, which is to say basically exactly what I was talking about with Christine de Pizan, that women have more feeling for the world and they would be kinder to soldiers. They would be peacemakers, right? We wouldn't have any more war. You still hear this all the time. Like if women ran the world, there would be no war. But the thing that makes this different from Christine, right? When I was talking about, the pro-woman vision of the world, I was saying that you need the man and the woman in this scenario, right? You need men to pursue justice and to pursue hard-nosed rationality, and you need women to remind men of the emotional truth of the world. And that interplay is what makes the world go round. Then, of course, this like female supremacy idea, right? That actually men are worthless and we ought to just have, if women just ran the world, there would never be any wars. And of course, the problem with this is that if women ran the world, there would still be all the things that cause wars. And so you would have strong men trying to build empires, and you would have all the sort of nasty things that we try to ignore when we try to avoid war, right? And so the subtle thing here is that because the men have their own problems, the women end up thinking of themselves basically like in this utopian way, that if we just had total control, well, we wouldn't have any vices at all, right? We're perfect. It's the men that have all these problems. So they do this and it actually works. And so let's now talk about, how they install total communism in the city. You guys know our sponsor, Public Goods. They've been with us for a while, and at this point, they have practically decorated my entire house because I love their basics so much. They make all these great products that are clean, right? They're free of the weird, like, chemical additives that you might get at the grocery store, and I'm a health nut, but they also look really good. Like, they have these soaps that look great on your kitchen sink. They have a ton of snacks that are also in this awesome sort of sleek packaging, and you get chocolate-covered almonds, which is my particular favorite. I cannot shut up about it because I can't stop eating them. And then my cat, Chad Cat, loves their freeze-dried duck nibs, which I really just love to say, but he does kind of go berserk over them. And they make all sorts of stuff, all sorts of basics for your home. You can trust them to make high-quality products at a reasonable price that will look good. And the deal that they have is just incredible. There's no reason not to do this. You're dumb if you don't. It's $15 of free stuff on your first Public Goods order when you go to publicgoods.com/heretics or use the code heretics at checkout. That's publicgoods.com/heretics to get $15 off your first order with no minimum purchase. Go get your free stuff. What are you waiting for? publicgoods.com/heretics. So we get this reported to us by Blepyrus and a companion. These are two men in the city, and they're talking about what happened at the assembly, which begins at dawn. And so Blepyrus has missed it, and he's getting filled in by this fellow Cremes. And Cremes says, a pale young man, as pretty as the little Nicias, got up and started addressing the assembly. He proposed that we should give the women governance of Athens. All those pale-faced shoemakers immediately erupted into cheers and roared, well said, while all the people in the country grumbled in the background. Leporus says they were the smart ones, Cremies, but they were outnumbered. The speaker hushed them with his shouts, insisting women only did right and you much wrong. Leporus, what did he say? Cremies, first off, he said you are a crook. Leporus, okay, and what did you get called? Cremies, I'll tell you later. Then he said you were a thief. Leporus, just me? Cremies, that's right. And then he called you a snitch. Leporus, just me? Cremies, yes, you and all these people, and this is pointing out to the audience, which is one of the routine gags in old comedy, and tells you something. Actually, old comedy is really good. Tragedy does this too a little bit, but old comedy is great at reminding you what a small community Athens ultimately was, and how you could make these references to, like, oh, Nicias, that guy, and all these guys out here, and there are, particular people in the audience that get made fun of. It's sort of like if you lived in like a small neighborhood in the Upper West Side, and you went to like an improv show, and they might be able to say, oh, my cousin's in the audience, this sort of stand-up comedy thing. And we think of Athens because it has this huge influence on our history and on our sort of cultural sense of the West. We think of it as this sort of vast empire. And of course, it did eventually end up building a kind of maritime empire. But in point of fact, it was a polis, right? It was a city where people knew each other and they were talking about how to do things. And they did many things that you could only do if everybody sort of knew one another and there was this deep connected sense of civic friendship. And you get that feeling from these comedies, one of the best reasons to read them. And that makes this whole satire very pointed, right? It's like, you guys are all louts, right? You're the worst. And it's this kind of mote in your own eye thing, right? That women have never had political power. And so they imagine that they're just going to use it only ever for the good. It will just be perfect to be run in a world run by women. Like I say, still a fantasy that we have. And it's connected, in fact, to the fantasy of communism, because both are these sort of utopian ideas that if you just like overturned the entirety of how nature works, right, the baseline facts of the world, then you could get people arranged in the perfect kind of way. And so here's, in fact, how Praxagora institutes communism. She says, let no one cut me off and start repudiating me before he hears and fully understands just what I am proposing to him. Here's what I say, that every person have a share in everything, and there be no more public property. Henceforth, there will be no more rich and poor, no more of one man owning lots and lots of acres, while another lacks sufficient land for his own grave, no more of one man having slaves in great abundance, while another lacks even a lone attendant. No, what I propose is that henceforth there be identical conditions of existence for us all. Leporus says, how do you mean, for all? Praxagora, you'd want to eat manure before I do. Leporus, oh, won't manure be shared as well? Praxagora, no, you cut me off too soon. This is what I have tried to tell you. First off, I will make all land, all money, all that any person owns, collective property. By proper management, frugality, and due consideration, we all will live off this collected wealth. Leporus, but what about the man who has no land, but only gold and silver coins, the inconspicuous kind of wealth? Praxagora, he must present them to the common fund, or else be sentenced as a perjurer. Leporus, that's how he got them in the first place. Praxagora, money will not be useful to him anyway. And Leporus says, and why is that? Nobody will be doing anything out of a desperate lack. Everyone will have everything he needs, bread, salted fish, wheat cakes, wine, clothing, garlands, chickpeas. What would be the benefit to him of not surrendering his coins? If you can find one, let me know. Leporus, even right now, though, isn't it the biggest thieves who have the money? And Praxagora says, my friend, that was before, when we were living under backward customs. Now that we will be taking all we need out of a common fund, where is his stake in not contributing his coins? So this is exactly the set of arguments that you get for communism, right? And it develops into this kind of utopian vision, right? Well, how are you going to do all of this management? Well, we've got it all figured out. Don't worry about that. Just hand over your wealth, right? And later on, Praxagora says, every man will have all that he needs to live and more. You will all leave the feast, drunk, torch in hand, and with a garland on. Women will run to meet you in the streets and say, come to my house. You'll find a gorgeous young girl there. Another from a window on the second floor will shout at you, I have a young, fine, fair-skinned one. Except, before you touch her, you must sleep with me. And all the ugly men, trailing the handsome ones, will mock them with, hey, where do you think you're going? It doesn't matter. You'll be getting nothing anyway. The law demands that we, the snub-nosed and the plain, first fuck the women. You can pass the downtime screwing yourself with both hands on your twin nut dangling branch. So it's incredibly filthy, but again, it's all very expertly done to play up the absurdity of it. Because Praxagoras keeps saying, like, oh, it's going to be great. It's going to be great. And Blepharos keeps saying, well, what about, like, what about money? And what about how are we going to make sure everybody gets enough to eat? Well, you're constantly going to leave the feast from, stuffed and full. And there's going to be all sorts of food to eat. And at the center of it is this idea of the abolition of the family. And people don't emphasize this enough, interestingly, since it's so important for the way that the modern world is currently going. The abolition of the family goes right back to Marx and Engels themselves, so the very beginning of Marxism. I'm going to talk a lot about that. Let me read now from the Communist Manifesto. Abolition of the family. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie. But this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians and in public prostitution. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. Let's be precise about what's being said here. Basically, Marxists believe that, like many institutions, the family is an artifice designed to perpetuate the systems of power that keep managers and bosses in place over the working class, right? The working class is the one that creates the value, the labor. It's called the labor theory of value. It's completely ridiculous and doesn't work. You can ask an economist why, but I just note that in passing. But the idea here is that then all sorts of self-justifications and false consciousnesses arise to perpetuate the power relations that exist, and whoever is in power, right, creates this these set of institutions, and the family is no different, right? The bourgeois family is based on capital, on private gain, and the way that you can see this is true. This is so interesting. Is that if you look at the proletariat and public prostitution, you will find that, in fact, there's just a sexual free-for-all. Now, I can't imagine what is meant by the practical absence of the family among the proletarians, unless it's a complete slander of the working class. This idea that, well, poor people just sleep around all the time, right? They're not able to consolidate their wealth. And, the idea, of course, right, is that in your family, you consolidate your wealth. You use your children as part of your, wealth-gathering means. You put them out to farm or to work, and then they inherit your wealth, and you gain more and more wealth generationally, right? This whole thing is based on capital, right? No room for love here, no room for like anything other, fidelity, chastity, anything other than the motivation of gain, right? And then the proletarians apparently are supposed to not do this. But of course, if you go into working class communities in traditional society, you talk to working class men and women in England, they will be incredibly austere, right? And it's often the upper classes that are sort of loose and debauched and open with their family relations, right? But the proletarians are often, and this is usually the case when you get down to Marxist claims about the proletariat, it's usually completely absurd because the working class have to deal with reality. And so in the harsh realities of the world, they know that the family is not just about wealth, although it is an economic unit. The family is also, right, about love, about cuddling together against the howling winds of the world and creating something stable with roles and trust, right? This is Aristotle's idea of the family. And in order to understand how radical this Marxist idea is, you have to understand what Aristotle says about the family, which is that it is the fundamental political unit. It is essentially the atom, the building block of all politics. And that's because it's natural, right? Marxism, always famously the enemy of what we think of as natural, thinks of it as socially constructed, as an excuse for gaining wealth. Aristotle says, no, there are three relations that are at the center of all politics. They are the relation between husband and wife, between parent and child, and between master and slave. And when he says that, we have to remember, right, that, Aristotle, I don't want to sugarcoat it, right? Aristotle had different ideas about slavery than we have. We abhor chattel slavery. But slavery in the ancient world was also a kind of economic relation of protection, right? That you were part of the household and you were sort of a servant in the house, right? So we might include now there's the relationship here of like employer and employee or something along those lines. But the fundamental idea, right, is that there are three basic relationships, the center of which is creating children and creating human capital in the good sense of the word, not in the kind of parasitic sense that Marx is using it, but in the sense that, like, this is the natural way that we perpetuate ourselves, that we grow and get better, is the family. And this is, again, why the abolition of women is so important to the transhumanist project, is because if you abolish the family and you break it down, then you can create a kind of generalized need for the state to be doing the work that the family naturally does. That's why they always come after the family. And if you don't believe me, here are some modern communists saying basically the same thing. Sophie Lewis, who's a feminist scholar, says, want to dismantle capitalism, abolish the family. You can find this in an interview with her in The Nation. She's also written a book about it. She says, I found myself stating the obvious. Gestation was work already before it got commodified as commercial surrogacy. So how do we build a politics that bridges these two workplaces and build solidarity between paid and unpaid gestators? It's a central idea to feminism anyway, that mothers aren't natural entities. They come right out and tell you what they believe. You got to hand it to them, right? Mothers aren't natural entities. They are making choices to look after this other person. It's not some sort of mechanical, automatic process. It's a practice of grounding sociality. Mothers nurture, but they also kill and abuse their wards. That's why it's so valuable to denaturalize the mother-child bond. To do anything else is to devalue that work. That's the horizon that I think opens up the space for revolutionary politics. Again, pay attention to this and hold that Aristotle in the background of one of the foundational relationships, the two of the foundational relationships of politics, right? The love between a husband and a wife, and the relation between a parent and a child, right? Mothers aren't natural entities, and look at how she uses the word natural, right? They aren't natural entities. They're making choices to look after this other person, which means that no choice can ever be more natural than any other choice. Now, we've talked about nature before, but let's just review, because I know that there are new people with us all the time, and I want to make sure that we're really on the same page, right? Nature is a word that comes to us distantly from the Greek word physis. And the Greek word physis, in turn, comes from a verb, phuo, to grow, right? And so physis is growing. And it's this idea that, like, flowers grow, right? If they have sun, and if they have water, and if they have all this stuff, nutrient, soil, right? Then if you don't do anything to them, seeds will grow spontaneously into flowers. Now, Sophie Lewis is using that idea to say that everything natural just has to happen like a machine. And this is something that we've gotten also out of modern science, right? That we can only study things that work like clockwork. And so either the human brain works like clockwork, or it's not, it's just not natural at all, and we can't study it by science, right? But Aristotle says something very different, and the philosophical Western tradition is something very different, which is that if you are a being that has free will, then you also have a nature, and that nature is to make choices according to reason. And so just because your choice is involved doesn't mean that every choice is equally natural or unnatural, right? And your brain is just this kind of floating spirit that's totally unrelated to your body, and there's no constraints on it, based in, the nature of the world, right? The idea of natural law, right, is that the world is constructed a certain way, and you are a free agent within it who nevertheless has to operate according to the constraints of the natural world, and your soul and your body are part of that world. And so the idea that making a choice to kill a child versus making a choice to nurture a child, there's no difference there, right? Neither one of those is more natural, right? That's why Sophie Lewis wants to denaturalize the mother-child bond. And then when you do that, of course, what happens? It all becomes a matter of economics. And this is the way that Marxism always explodes itself, right? You start out by getting rid of wealth, getting rid of money. But of course, if you take away nature and love and theology and philosophy of, the traditional kind, what are you left with except money? What are you left with except work, right? And work, of all kinds, no matter what, sex work and, curing cancer, these are the same as long as we value them the same. And this is why you get these ridiculous articles like in the New York Times about like how much exactly would it cost to pay mothers for the work that they do? And they come up with some obscene figure. But of course, that's a drop in the bucket. The work that mothers do is infinite, right? And because it's infinite, it's completely immeasurable according to the market. And so Marxists who want essentially to calculate everything neatly according to market value and then organize it brilliantly according to the right distribution of wealth, right? They always end up devaluing everything except what you might pay somebody to do. And there is a word for that, which is not very pretty, right? And it is, in fact, prostitution. It's like get rid of the family, and what you actually end up with is a form of prostitution and forms of coercion. And I've taken time to get there because I want you to know about how this stuff is working in the modern world, and because I want you to understand what then happens in this brilliant play by Aristophanes. Because again, if you blink, you miss these things. But what happens next is that everything starts to fall apart, and it starts to fall apart. It doesn't say this, it doesn't come out and say this, but it starts to fall apart exactly along the lines of nature. It's because human beings do have a nature, and not just a physical, mechanical nature, but an actual nature that they, ought to be living into with their choices. Because we have that nature, things like communism ultimately fall apart because human beings are a certain way. So let's see how that works out here in the play. I am telling you, people love this Gold River Trading Company tea that they've been getting. I am so excited about this sponsor because they truly did solve a problem for me. After coming back to the US from my time in the UK, I really had gotten into tea, but we don't make good tea in this country, which is a shame because it's a big part of our history and it's an extremely civilized drink. They make a bunch of different kinds at Gold River Trading Company, and it's all excellent. You go to goldriverco.com to check out our 1776 American breakfast blend. I love that it's all American themed, American made. And when you enter the promo code Heretics at checkout, you get 10% off. That's Heretics, Heretics. You get 10% off all of their teas on your first order. I really love their green tea. They have this chamomile flavor that I've been using because I'm off caffeine for Lent, which is a bit of a slog, but it's better with Gold River Trading Company. And obviously they make a bunch of caffeinated teas as well, including, like I mentioned, the American breakfast black tea. So go to goldriverco.com and use the promo code Heretics, Heretics, just like in the title of the show, for 10% off. So there are two kind of extended scenes in this play that show the workings of why this ostensible utopia is going to become a disaster. And I always want to give you a caveat when I'm reading into something. And in fact, the play is going to end with a sort of offstage feast, right? Where they break into they take everybody's wealth and they open it up, and it's just like this vast feast of all the wealth of the city. And so that part, actually, it looks like everything is going great, right? But before that, you have these two long scenes about conflicts, unresolved conflicts that show the tension under the surface. And so the first one is about they're telling everybody that they need to give up their wealth. And this guy comes on who's like, well, I don't want to do that. So here's that scene. So this is a scene, like I said, between an unnamed man and his neighbor. The neighbor is going in to just hand over all his wealth. It's going to be great. We're going to share everything. And I'm bringing like my pots and my pans and just everything I've ever inherited. And the guy says, this sucker's going to lose all that he possesses. The neighbor says, you just keep exaggerating. The man says, how exaggerating? As if I haven't seen such laws before. Don't you recall the mandate that they passed regarding salt? The neighbor says, I do. Man says, don't you remember when we voted out those copper coins? Neighbor, I do. Those things proved terrible for me because when I had sold my grapes, I stuffed my whole mouth full of them and went to market to buy some barley. Then when I held out my little bag of coins, the herald blares, nobody's taking copper anymore. We're on to silver now. The modern equivalent of this, by the way, is the cashless society, right? Exerting more and more control over the currency. And in fact, Joe Biden recently just announced that he was going to look into creating a federal digital currency so that Bitcoin will be supposedly rendered obsolete, right? The guy says, didn't we just lately vow we'd raise 500 talents for Athens off the tax Euripides had levied? Oh my, yes, Euripides was made of gold. But when we looked more closely, we saw his tax was just the same old story and not enough for what we needed. Then, oh my, Euripides was tarred and feathered. Neighbor, buddy, it's not the same. Back then, we men were ruling. Now the women are in charge. This is another great, it's amazing how much of this is just taken right out of modern life. The women have some sort of magic, right? That all if they make all these stupid mistakes, well, they're the women, they're in charge. They're nicer, right? So it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. And the neighbor says, you're talking nonsense. I just don't understand. The man says, I will watch them closely by Poseidon, or else they'll piss on me. So this is this very intriguing kind of exchange between the bright-eyed optimist who's just kind of a sucker for every grand new plan. And it's sort of like, oh, now, it's just 15 days to slow the spread. Like, oh, now we've got the vaccine. Now they're going to let us out. Like, oh, now the booster's here, so we're going to be fine. This sort of credulous person who just wants, in a sweet sort of way, to believe in the virtue of what his state or his nation, or in this case, his city, is doing. And then the guy who's like, but we've done this, like all this dumb crap before. Like politicians always say they've got some perfect scheme to fix the universe. They're always going to tinker around with the money in just the right way so that you can make $1 million off of $1 in taxes or something like crazy that they're trying to figure out. And of course, just because it's women doing it now doesn't make it any different. And so this is this interesting way in which, the feminist utopia does sort of create like Mary Sue's, like perfect women out of everybody. And this idea that somehow women doing exactly the same thing that men have done in the past is going to be better. This goes on. We sort of continue, like I say, these are extended scenes. We continue with the man and his neighbor. And the man eventually says, like, what am I going to do about this? Because he doesn't want to give his stuff up. And he says, what I need's a plan that will allow me both to keep my things and have a share of all the delicacies that they are preparing for the people of Athens. Aha, I think I've got it. I must go in to dine with them and I must go in there quick. Now, this is an interesting development because this guy is kind of smart, right? He sort of sees through the BS that the politicians are putting forward, these constant repetitions of everything's going to be great, we're going to have everything we need. And yet his neighbor is basically impenetrable. Like it's impossible for him to get through to people that have been hoodwinked by this utopian vision. And so he just says, well, I guess I better figure out a way to become a freeloader. And the reason that I say that all of this comes back to nature, right, is because people want to own things. And they want to own things not because they're selfish or greedy, but because personal attachment to things and to people is what makes us as human beings live and breathe and have joy, right? And that personal attachment, like this is my wife and not somebody else's. This is my friend and not everybody else's, right? This is my child and nobody else's, which is not like, mine in the sense of like, I own you, but simply mine in the sense of like, I have special care over this person. That oath, right? There are many rifles like it, but this one is mine, that says something. It says like, this is the thing that I cherish and am devoted to. And even if there are other people in the world that I could have been with, and there are plenty of women obviously in the world, nevertheless, this is the one that I choose to be with. And there develops a special affection, and the nature of that goes down into our possessions as well, right? You take care of a house if it's yours. You take care of a bike if it's yours. One of the things that parents often do with their kids is they give them something to own so that they learn the virtue and the value, or they make them buy something even better, right? So then they take care of that thing, they clean it, they wash it, right? And you learn this idea that if you own something, you have a certain devotion and attachment to it. This is another idea that we've been at before from different angles, right? That people don't go to war for the world or the free world. And even if we talk about it in those terms, those are actually sort of emotionally distant. What people really go to war for, or really do virtuous deeds for, or really sacrifice for is like their lover or their friend, right? Or they think, you always have to make it concrete because we're embodied beings. And so you have to look at your house and your wealth and all this stuff. And that is why capitalism and I would just say trade and money and personal possessions, right? Because capitalism itself is kind of this Marxist slander that it's all about generating fake wealth and being a parasite on labor. But of course, trade and capitalism at its heart is really just about this idea that you have a right to the sweat of your brow, and this is natural. And so the man's protests are natural. They are just like, this is sort of what is going to happen if you tell people we have to take away all your stuff so that we can make the world perfect. And that natural impulse, even though it is flawed, right, and eventually can lead to vice, nevertheless is something to listen to. And if you just shove people's natural impulses away, if you force them to get over them, eventually you're going to end up with people breaking your stupid rules, right? And that's what this guy ends up doing. And that's one of the major things about communism, is that you end up with people that just don't want to work, or people that, are simply disillusioned by the whole system. And so then everything breaks down because it requires like this total cooperation. It's why they keep throwing people into the gulag, is because until everybody is 100% on board and obedient, it can never work. And that means it literally will never work. And it's just a self-perpetuating cycle of basically killing people either by famine or by imprisonment. And this is, actually weirdly, Aristophanes now helps us to understand Solzhenitsyn, right? Because Aristophanes, like all great comics, is the great observer of what people are actually like, right? The vices of men, the vices of women, the way that they are weak, the way that they are attached, and just the way that they have, little peccadillos and little loves and desires, right? That's part of what comedy does, is it shows us the reality of people and how far it is from the ideal perfection that we might imagine in our perfect universe, right? And this applies also to the sex rule, right? Remember, I read that the rule is if you want to sleep with somebody hot, you have to sleep with somebody ugly first. And Aristophanes ends up showing you how just unnatural and horrifying that is. He has this scene where a young man and a young girl try to get together, and the young man is basically dragged off by these two ugly hags who just want to have their way with him. It's essentially a rape scene. So the fella's name is Epigenes or Epigenes, and he's got his girl that he's trying to sleep with, and then these old women. So the girl says to the first old woman, "Where are you taking him?" The old woman says, "I'm bringing my own man back to my house." The girl says, "That wouldn't be a prudent thing to do. Young as he is, he's not the proper age to go to bed with you. You're much more like his mother than his wife. If you begin to live by this new law, you will be making all the men of Athens Oedipuses," which is to say, of course, you'll make them sleep with their mothers, right? The first old woman says, "You filthy whore, you're jealous. That's why you came up with that. I'll get you back for it." Epigenes says, "By Zeus the Savior, you have earned my thanks, sweetheart, for driving off that foul old thing. Tonight as compensation, I will slip you a great big meaty favor in return." The second old woman comes on and says, "Stop that. By dragging off this gentleman, you are committing an illegal act. He must first sleep with me. That's what the law says." "Oh no," says Epigenes, "what hole has loosed you on the world, you damned and horrid thing? This monster looks even more ugly than the one before." Second old woman, "Come here now." Epigenes says to the girl, "Please don't let her drag me off." Second old woman says, "It is the law, not me, that drags you off." And Epigenes says, "Please let me go. Then I'll steel myself for sex. If you don't let me, you'll have to see me be defiled with terror. That is, I'll drop a load right here." Second old woman, "Be strong. Keep moving. You can poop inside." Epigenes, "I feel that I'll do more than poop in there." And so this is like, again, it's filthy, it's bawdy, it's hilarious. There's like tons of jokes, but it's also kind of horrifying. And it shows you something about communism, again, not a word that Aristophanes could have used, but it shows you something about koinonia, which is that in order to equalize everybody, you have to elevate the naturally ugly and horrifying and horrid. And this fundamentally is why we are constantly circulating all these images, on the cover of Vogue or, in Nike ads of like, this is healthy. This is what real women's bodies look like. And it's like an obese person, why are we constantly celebrating, the least healthy things and trying to quote unquote destigmatize them? It's because in order for true equality of this kind, which is actually true sameness and not real equality, but sameness, you have to strip away all of people's natural responses to things, right? We don't actually want to sleep with everybody equally. Some things are beautiful. And in order to accept the beauty of things, you also have to accept that some things are less beautiful. And that can be hard and difficult and can, disadvantage people unfairly. And yet it is the nature of the world. It's the world in which we live. And there has to be some sort of difference between beauty and ugliness, or else there's no such thing as beauty, right? And you lose everything by flattening it all out into one and just stripping away nature and elevating all that is ugly and decrepit and false, right? And that's what happens here. And it effectively results in a legalized rape scene, right? It is the law that drags you off, not me. Aristophanes is great at slipping chilling dystopian horror into these beautiful, comedies of just, ribaldry and fun. It's actually a very rare gift to be able, and it takes a really light touch to kind of show the horror of a thing while also being fun and hilarious, right? So let's talk now more about this as a modern movement and Aristophanes' sort of prediction of everything that we are currently facing. Let me tell you about Theragun. I have been using this for a while before they were sponsors, and I'm super excited to bring you a deal on the Theragun because it is an excellent handheld percussive therapy device that releases your deepest muscle tension. You guys know that I'm kind of a weightlifting fanatic, and that causes all sorts of aches and pains if you do it long enough and hard enough. But even if you're not an athlete, you can really get a lot out of just releasing some of the tension that you build up throughout the day. A lot of us spend a lot of time sitting at our computers or like hunched over, or else if you have a manual labor job, then all the more reason to get this device to kind of just even things out a little bit. That was what I was shocked at when I first started using Theragun. Was like, I thought that I was fine, I stretched, whatever, it's good. But actually there was, especially my shoulders and my lower back, there was just a ton of tension that I managed to release with their specifically calibrated combo of depth, speed, and power. Really a top-notch product. And you can try it now if you're a Young Heretics listener for 30 days, starting at only $199 when you go to therabody.com/heretics. That's therabody.com/heretics. You go there right now and get your Gen 4 Theragun today. One more time, it's therabody.com/heretics. You got to check it out. So I talked to you about how communism and the abolition of the family go together. They've gone together since the Communist Manifesto. It's simply part and parcel of this whole ideology. And you hear it when people like Sophie Lewis tell you about it, right? Here's Joe Matthews, another schmuck, writing in the San Francisco Chronicle. This was 2022, this year. Want true equity? California should force parents to give away their children. Why is this a thing? It's a thing because if equity means equalizing everything, right? As opposed to equality, which means equality before the law, recognition of everybody's common humanity, right? Equality is just like everybody should have the same amount of everything, right? And if you want that, then you're going to have to tear the wealth and the love and the relationships out of people's arms, right? And that's never figured in to these Marxist ideas, except as some kind of glorious revolution, right? And that's why the revolutions themselves are always bloodbaths, because they actually, in practice, what they involve is tearing children out of parents' arms. And they involve pressuring people into sex. This is also a thing that is happening in our effort, our neo-Marxist effort to flatten out the distinction between men and women, right? If everybody has to be just a widget in a, perfectly functioning economic machine, then men and women can't have differences. We've been talking about this for weeks now, right? And so what happens then? Well, here's a BBC article. We're being pressured into sex by some trans women, in which you have reports from people. Here's a 24-year-old woman who says, I've had someone saying they would rather kill me than Hitler. They said they would strangle me with a belt if they were in a room with me and Hitler. This was so bizarrely violent just because I won't have sex with trans women. So these are men who are transitioning to a male to female transition, right? And you saw this also happening in Loudoun County, right? That this boy put on a dress in Virginia. He went into a girl's bathroom. And this pressure for sex, this political pressure for sex is not limited to the Assemblywomen, right? It is part and parcel. What I'm trying to show you is that this is built in to the communist utopian ideal, because the communist utopian ideal is anti-nature, and nature includes personal attachments. And so from the Republic and the Ecclesiasdusae on to the Communist Manifesto and on to Loudoun County and the pressure for women to let men who dress up as women into their locker rooms and into their gyms and into their sports and to let them have sex with them, right? These are all real things, and they're all part of the attempt to strip nature away. You can't do away with nature without some kind of violence, and that's the violence that we get in the comedy of the Assemblywomen. Let me just read to you now the very end, right, so that you know how this all ends. I think it's chillingly and beautifully done. You may disagree with me and think that Aristophanes is just, endorsing communism here, and actually in the end it all turns out fine. I think it's obvious that that's not the case given the speeches that we've just read. But let me, so that I want to be as honest as possible, so let me read, they end up sort of dancing off, the chorus and the women end up dancing off, dear ladies, come make haste, let's all go to the feast so we can have our share of it. Let the wild rhythms of Crete put wild movement in your feet. Leporus is dancing, I am. The chorus says, you girls, make sure your light steps too, keep time. Now there will be served en masse, limpet saltfish, dogfish, shark, mullets, sardines and pickle sauce, rooster, crusted wagtail, lark, thrush, blackbird, dove and slices of mulled wine marinated hare, all drenched in oil and vinegar, silphium, honey, all the spices. Hey, now that you've heard about the feast, go grab a plate and raise some dust, running to get your hands on pudding. Leporus says, oh yeah, the town's already eating. Chorus says, lift up your feet now. Hey, 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 we're off to eat. Hooray, hooray, this feels like victory. Hooray, hooray. I find this one of the most sort of chilling and dystopian endings to a play that you could imagine, because they're all going off. And of course, it's the first meal, right? It's the first time they aggregated everybody's wealth. Their collected wealth is going to make this big feast. They're going to dig into all the storehouses, and just everybody's going to love it. And they're dancing. And you've just seen, right, the way that it's all going to go terribly wrong. In the background, men are being effectively raped by old women, and other people are sort of plotting how they're going to cheat the system. And you can see the seeds of it breaking down as they dance off, and it's all going to be great. It's all so fun, It's actually a perfect portrayal of how this stuff works. You get these beautiful, like, oh, hooray, like, the summer of love, here it comes, it's the age of Aquarius. And then in the end, nature comes back. This is, of course, the old Horace poem, if you chase nature out with a broomstick, she comes back in the back door. That was a favorite quotation of Leo Strauss, I believe, and one that we ourselves are constantly coming up against in our modern era of Assemblywomen, Part 2. It's a great play. You should go read it. It's really quick, and that Aaron Puchigian translation is filthy but excellent, and filthy on purpose. Let me read to you just one more passage from Aristotle, which I've read to you before, but it's a response to everything that we've been talking about. This is Politics, Book 2, Chapter 4. The community of wives and children seems better suited to the husbandmen than to the guardians, for if they have wives and children in common, they will be bound to one another by weaker ties, as a subject class should be, and they will remain obedient and not rebel. For friendship we believe to be the greatest goods of states and the preservative of them against revolutions. Neither is there anything which Socrates so greatly lauds as the unity of the state, which he would declare to be created by friendship. But the unity which he commends would be like that of the lovers in the symposium, who, as Aristophanes says, desire to grow together in the excess of their affection, and from being two become one. This is the idea that when you meld everything together, it's like diluting a little bit of wine in a lot of water. That the personal loves and attachments get diluted, and we just have this sort of soup of mediocrity. And that is where all of this tends. Do not dilute your loves. Your personal attachments are natural. They are okay for you to have. Let nobody talk you out of them. Now let's take a very interesting mailbag question from locals by a woman who was writing to me about this idea of ugliness and beauty. I'd like to address this because I find it really fascinating. You guys, I want to invite you to read a book with me. It's published by the Albertus Magnus Institute, which is our sponsor. They do wonderful courses that I've been raving to you about. And this is their inaugural publication. It's called The Sufferings and Glory of Christ, a meditation on Holy Week to Ascension by Father Owen Carroll. I'm really excited to read it. It's already doing super well, getting rave reviews. And it's a wonderful way to experience the lead up to Easter and then the following celebration of Christ's resurrection in the church. If you're like me, you have been doing some sort of Lenten observation. Even if you haven't, now is a great time to start. This is the high holy days of the church. There is no more important time to be thinking about this stuff. Even if you're not currently religious, you should check it out. It's The Sufferings and Glory of Christ, which I am going to be using as a devotional reading throughout Holy Week. And I'll share some of my thoughts about it on Locals, and we'll kind of chat more about that there. All you got to do is go to magnusinstitute.org or Amazon to check out The Sufferings and Glory of Christ, a meditation on Holy Week to Ascension. We'll make excellent devotional reading for this season. Join me. You won't regret it. So Locals is a platform where it's created by my pal, Dave Rubin, who's a big free speech advocate. None of this like garbage that you get on Twitter or wherever it intervenes to sort of censor people or whatever. You can say anything you want. You can talk about anything. And we do. We talk about life, the universe, and everything. I do live streams. I write essays. I'm doing a running commentary on the book of Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans right now, translating it from the Greek and commenting on it. There's just a ton of exclusive stuff that you can get when you become a VIP at youngheretics.com/locals. We're offering a 1-month free trial for this episode only. If you use the offer code ASSEMBLY, ASSEMBLY, then you can get a month off your annual subscription at youngheretics.com/locals. Okay, here's Brenda. She says, well, I asked people for questions about womanhood and womanly virtue. She says, you asked for it. For most of my life, I was a feminist. Since converting to conservatism in 2020, I have been trying to come to terms with conservative ideas on the meaning of sex and the body, specifically that the body is not just a meat suit, but is an expression of the soul, and correspondingly, that biological sex is not an assignment, but an expression of some fundamental reality about the self. Therefore, conservatives should, and in practice usually do, try to be conventionally attractive and follow conventional gender presentations. Well, I'm ugly, she says. That's why I was a liberal feminist. But now what? What does femininity mean for women who can't measure up, sometimes literally, to the traditional standards of feminine beauty, grace, etc.? Well, I think that this is a really searingly honest and riveting question. I mean, and I think that it is something that the right is kind of grappling with right now, because we are in this place of having to reaffirm the beauty of beauty, essentially, because we have this attempt to sort of break down beauty, break down, value structures, and just denature everything. And so conservatives are like, go to the gym. You should like look good. You should try to be jack, tan, and handsome. Or if you're a guy, or you should try to be, beautiful and demure if you're a woman. And the first thing that I want to express is that you can't get this backwards, right? And sometimes we do. Sometimes we say like, well, this person is ugly, and this is like we do like physiognomy checks on Twitter and stuff like this person is ugly, and so that must mean their soul is somehow corrupt. And that to me is getting it backwards. Conservatives believe that the body is an expression of the soul, but what they don't believe is that the soul is an expression of the body. Everybody is different, right? And physical beauty is only one kind of expression of beauty, because everybody can get fit, right? So there's a dimension of it that's like, there are some parts of your physical presence that don't have to do with like just the stuff you can't change, right? Your height, your whatever, your bust size, your whatever you're dissatisfied with about yourself. And I'm not going to pander to you by doing the thing where like, I bet you're actually beautiful. Like, I think that, you probably are better looking than you think you are, but whatever. If you have a sense of yourself as not being very attractive, I would suggest a couple things. First of all, I know that men can be pigs about this, and men, need to, I think, as men mature and as they cultivate their sense of themselves, they learn gradually that spiritual beauty does express itself in ways that are really palpable. And I have had friends, I'm not attracted to women, so it's like a little bit different, but I have had friends and straight friends will confirm this for me too, that like women will become more beautiful to them as they become more demure and lovely and feminine, and as they get to know these women, right? And so the physical presence that you put forward is in mysterious ways an expression of your soul, not the other way around. All of that having been said, right, in order to affirm that there are standards of sort of natural objective standards, we all have to accept that we fall short of various standards in various ways. And so what we can't do is go around saying, well, by affirming the good of beauty, we therefore like shun and exclude anybody that can't possibly live up to our perfect beauty ideals, right? That's not the way. And conservatives can do a better job of this, I think. What we are actually saying is beauty is a real thing, and we can celebrate it, even if it's painful for us to acknowledge that we don't have it. Like, and listen, everybody has this in some dimension of life. Like everybody is sitting around thinking, man, I wish, I wish I were taller. I wish I was a baller. I wish I was, these things that we sit around, everybody falls short in some way. I've talked to guys that I know are just like so, incredibly tall and muscular and good looking, and you think they have everything. They'll tell you about some insecurity they have, and you're like, wow, I'm glad I don't have to deal with that, And so this is the trade-off that conservatives do want to make. Accepting that there are natural goods in the world means that some things will fall short of those goods. It's not a condemnation of it. It's just part of the tragedy of life, right? And ultimately, the best that we can do is take what we have to work with and aspire to the ideals that we have as well as we can, as much and as well as we can. And if you're never, if you're never going to be a great goddess, right, that is far and away not the most important thing about being an ideal woman, right? Living into womanhood does not mean that everybody is going to look like a supermodel. The virtues that we've been talking about with Christine de Pizan are so much more important and will express themselves in subtle and mysterious ways in your physical presence, even if you will never look like Greta Garbo. Because believe me, like, you know, I understand everybody falls short in some way. And that's the price of acknowledging that some things are beautiful. But the alternative is to just flatten out beauty and live without it altogether, even in others. And if you have to say that because I don't have something, you know, I'm not going to recognize it in other people, then you've written yourself a recipe for just utter misery. That's the logic of hell, and that's why you're not a feminist anymore. So well done, Brenda. I really admire your honesty and your rigorous thinking through of these things. Thank you for being on Locals. I'll see you on there, and we'll talk more about this. youngheretics.com/locals to join, and I hope you will. That's it from me. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute, where I work. It's a think tank for the recovery of the American idea. We put out The American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books, and you can help support us by going to claremont.org/donate. Let them know in the notes that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics. And come back next week. It's been a pleasure. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.